That rhetoric guy. Perhaps some of the most misused and misunderstood aspects of rhetoric are actually some of its most basic. The three general terms, ethos, logos, pathos. Too many students use these terms incorrectly. Too often teachers overly rely on their importance. So this video is meant to mitigate some of those issues. So first off, let's look at some specific definitions here. We've got ethos. In Greek, this more or less means character, and it should be fairly clear as to how modern English has gotten the word ethics out of this, morality. To add clarity, I tend to include a number of other things in the definition to help students get a feel for it. Things like your formal education, hands-on experience, wisdom, authority, bias, integrity. What's more, ethos isn't always just limited to you, the speaker, the writer. Ethos is part of a relationship. It doesn't just cover your personal character, but your public profile, how others see and react to you. Integrity isn't just about you. Integrity is a part of building trust in a relationship. Second, we have logos. Now this more or less is translated as to speak, but most people tend to use kind of a simpler definition, logic, because that's more what it looks like. So to add clarity, I add things like facts, which are points of data, evidence, which are facts that point to one conclusion over another, statistics and studies, the act of rationally thinking through an issue, being careful and specific and precise and accurate with your words and phrasing, and even the use of good argumentation tactics like having a thesis, having reasons, having evidence, having warrants or justifications that connect all those things together. Notice that just like ethos, logos is not limited just to your logic. It's about how the words work together. It's about how others can follow your logical chain of reasoning. And finally, pathos. Now, pathos could be literally translated as pathetic, but not with the modern kind of negative connotation. Pathetic or being worthy of pity originally had this broad definition of being emotionally involved or emotionally reactive. So for clarity, I add things like sympathy, the ability to perceive emotions, empathy, the ability to perceive emotions from a frame of reference outside of yourself, desire, psychology, and connotation, the emotional context of words outside of their dictionary meaning. Just like the previous two terms, pathos involves elements of the speaker and of the audience. It's a reciprocal kind of emotion. Okay, so there's a bigger issue that arises. Once you've learned the specific, accurate definitions of these words, and it's how you use them. One of the common ways that students will try to use these words in an essay would be something like, the author uses pathos. Well, the problem is that this phrasing doesn't actually make sense because it implies that pathos is a concrete thing and that the author activates it and then it works. But the truth is that ethos, logos, pathos are appeals. An appeal is an abstract action that involves a process and a relationship. You don't activate emotion and then go away. So instead of saying the author uses pathos, instead try to think about it like this. The author appeals to the audience's sense of pathos through some element of language in order to create some effect. In other words, you should begin to realize here that these terms are simply broad, generalized movements. And in order to talk about these movements effectively, you have to include in the conversation a discussion of the how, the process, and the why, the relationship. The author uses pathos doesn't include either of those things, nor does it really imply that you understand why we have these terms in the first place. To extend this point, these three terms are actually not the only kinds of appeals. For example, even staying within the ancient Greek traditional view of rhetoric, there's also kairos, meaning supreme time, which is an appeal meant to force the audience into seeing the immediacy and urgency of your point. And mythos, meaning narrative, is meant to appeal to an audience's cultural history and blood memory and tradition. You wouldn't say the author uses time. Instead, you might say the author prevents her audience from waiting to come to a decision through the use of a single run-on sentence. Notice in this example, I haven't even used the word kairos. I simply explain it. This is what these terms are for. They are guideposts to our understanding of how persuasion works. Because they're only abstract guides, after explaining these terms to my students, I often suggest that they never even use them in an essay, and instead focus on the specifics of how that appeal works in whatever passage they're looking at. Think of them as stepping stones, or scaffolding, or training wheels on a bike. Eventually, you learn enough balance to make the training wheels unnecessary. And just like that, in rhetoric, once you have a really good understanding of how ethos, logos, pathos work together, you don't really need to use those terms anymore. All right, so we have some accurate definitions, and we have clarified how to use those words. But you ask, my teacher talks about the rhetorical triangle. Is that the same thing? Good question, viewer. Similar, but different. While ethos and logos and pathos sometimes are depicted as the 3 points on a triangle, representing how rhetoric is this interwoven process that requires relationships, that's not really what we mean in the modern day by the rhetorical triangle. The rhetorical triangle is more a representation of the required components of a conversation. You need one, a writer or a speaker or someone actually delivering a message. Two, you need the text or the speech or the message itself. And then three, you need an audience or a reader or someone who receives the message. So again, this is a kind of scaffold, a way of looking at how communication works together. If we were to write an essay analyzing the rhetoric of a given text, yet we forgot to discuss how the intended audience probably would have perceived that message, or we neglect to mention how the author's bias prevented them from explaining the topic completely, or we missed a subtle distinction within the message itself, then our analysis would be both incomplete and flawed. So if I wanted to combine the rhetorical triangle with the appeals into kind of a simple graphic, I might show something like this. So here in this graphic, I try to make it clear that there are three unavoidable parts of communication, and that the appeals work in all directions across and through those parts, and that a good understanding of your own personal writing choices will come down to kind of an intuitive understanding of these relationships, and that better rhetorical analysis essays will come down to a more complete explanation of how these relationships work in any given text.